Hello there, guys. My name is Siobhan Fallon. I hope you're having a great day today. We've been talking an awful lot about the Battle of the Washita, which occurred on November 27, 1868, when the U.S. Seventh Cavalry attacked the southern Cheyenne village of Chief Black Kettle. Lieutenant Colonel George Custer was acting under the orders of General Sheridan at the time, who said to, quote, destroy their village and ponies, to kill or hang all warriors, and bring back all women and children. Custer did exactly that. He returned to Camp Supply with 53 women and children. So, if you've been watching my series, you realize that there are quite a few controversies attributed to the 7th Cavalry at the Battle of the Washita. And today I thought we could touch upon the rather sensitive topic of whether the 7th Cavalry abused those captured Cheyenne women. And as most things, I think the truth is much more complicated than the story we're often presented with. So let's take a look at eyewitness accounts and the available oral tradition and see what we think. Thanks so much for joining me, guys. As a quick aside, please know I am working on a separate presentation that deals with the specific rumors about Custer and the 19-year-old captive named Monacita. Okay, so I think the best way to start is to look at the accusations leveled against the 7th Cavalry. Captain Frederick Benteen of the 7th Cavalry would write in a later letter, of course you have heard of the informal invitation from Custer to officers desiring to avail themselves of the services of a captured woman to come to the roundup corral and select one. Custer took first choice and lived with her during the winter and spring of 1868 and 1869. Ben Clark was the chief of scouts for the 7th Cavalry at the Battle of the Washita. He was interviewed by Walter Camp in 1910, and he asked not to be quoted. And these are notes that Walter Camp took during this interview. Supposedly, Ben Clark said, many of the women captured at the Washita were used by the officers. Says that Romero was put in charge of them, and on the march, Romero would send women around to the officers' tents. Says Custer picked a fine-looking one and had her in his tent every night. The author Charles Brill wrote in his book, Conquest of the Southern Plains, in only one instance did Magpie deviate from his firm stand against hearsay evidence. This was in the matter of the mistreatment of the women prisoners Custer carried away from the Washita. When hard-pressed for comment on this subject, Magpie said he had heard some of the victims recount experiences corroborating the story of indignities. Little Beaver said his mother, Red Dress, one of the prisoners, told upon her return to her people. It was Red Dress who appealed to Romeo, one of Custer's half-breed scouts, to save the women and children of Black Kettle's camp from the anticipated atrocities after their surrender. Out of gratitude for this intervention, Red Dress later offered Romeo one of her daughters to be his wife. It was Red Dress who related how, when the troops had returned to Camp Supply with women prisoners taken on the Washita, Custer and his officers approached the cowering group to select companions for a convivial night. Her story of this occurrence has been corroborated by Big Horse, a Cheyenne chief whose wife was one of those subjected to these indignities. Author Father Powell makes a statement in a footnote in his People of the Sacred Mountain. In later years, J. Black Kettle, keeper of the Sacred Arrows, John Hill, Mary Little Bear Inkanish, and John Stanson Timber all recalled and recounted the relationship between Monacita and Custer. They also recalled and recounted how young women were taken into soldier tents after their capture. So we'll begin with the comments made by Captain Frederick Benteen. His comments were written in a letter to Theodore Golden in 1896. That's nearly 30 years after the Washita. And for those of us who know a little bit about Benteen, his letters at this time were filled with all sorts of accusations against Custer. He accused his dead commander of blackmail, bribery, murder, fraud, and adultery, among other things. These accusations are unsubstantiated by any other member of the 7th Cavalry, and like any accusations leveled against anyone, without other proof or evidence, we've got to take them with a grain of salt. In this same group of letters to Golden, Benteen also makes accusations against other officers such as Miles Moylan, William Weiner Cook, Sam Sturgis, Marcus Reno, James Bell, among others. Benteen himself readily admits, "I've always known I had a happy facility of making enemies of anyone I ever knew." Ben Clark made his statements to Walter Camp in 1910. That's more than 40 years after the Washita. Now, in general, I tend to trust Ben Clark as a source. General Sheridan referred to Ben Clark as, quote, "the most reliable and accomplished man of his class on the plains." And for our purposes today, Ben Clark's connections with the Cheyenne make his testimony even more valuable. Clark was at the Washita on the behalf of the United States Army. He was working with and he knew United States soldiers, but he also knew the Cheyenne. He would marry not one, but 3 Southern Cheyenne women over the course of his lifetime. He and his wives would raise their children at the Cheyenne and Arapaho Darlington Agency or Reservation. So I see him as a man who had a foot in 2 worlds and insights into both. Though one thing of interest in his statement is he mentions the women were sent around to the officers' tents, quote, "on the march." And it was not only bitterly cold, but it took 3 days of a march to reach Camp Supply. And on the first night, at least, after the Washita fight, the column marched until the middle of the night in an effort to escape warriors who had gathered from other villages and started to surround Custer at the Washita. You will also notice in Ben Clark's statements, he implicates a man named Romero and says that he's the one who sent the women to the other tents. Who is this Romero? Rafael Romero was born around 1844 to a Mexican father and either an Arapaho or Cheyenne mother. He was captured by the Comanche when he was 9 and traded to the Kiowa. He lived most of his youth among the Southern Plains Indians. Romero served with the 1st Colorado Regiment of Cavalry during the Civil War, and historians think he was at the Sand Creek Massacre, either as an enlisted soldier or as a scout for Colonel John Chivington. During the winter campaign of 1868 and 1869, Romero was hired as a scout and interpreter for the 7th U.S. Cavalry. Custer sent Ben Clark and Romero to find the location of Black Kettle's village and the number of teepee. Romero entered the village supposedly and counted all 51 lodges. Later, during the fighting, Custer put him in charge of the 53 Cheyenne women and children captives. At some point, Romero was given the nickname Romeo. Like Ben Clark, Romero would have more than one Cheyenne wife during his lifetime. And in 1875, he accompanied the Kiowa, Comanche, and Cheyenne prisoners to St. Augustine, Florida. But he was dismissed by Captain Richard Pratt because Romero was fluent only in Cheyenne, which points out another interesting aspect of one of Ben Clark's later interviews, when Ben Clark says that Romero could only, quote, "talk signs with the Cheyenne. He had been with the Arapaho mostly and could not talk much Cheyenne." However, Romero is often connected with the woman red dress, especially in that Brill account that I read you earlier. So who is Red Dress? Red Dress is known by many names. If you watched my earlier video about Custer and the captives, Washita Part 2, I call her Mawissa, and that is the name Custer calls her in his memoir, My Life on the Plains, and that is the name by which she's usually known. Mawissa is called the cousin, sister-in-law, or sister of Chief Black Kettle, depending on the source. Mawissa's other names are Red Dress, Red Feather, and Red Sheath. She was the wife of Chief Wolf Looking Back and part of Chief Black Kettle's ruling entourage. And she is referred to as the, quote, wife of one of the principal chiefs. Author Charles Brill calls her a, quote, not inconsiderable person among the Cheyenne, but he doesn't realize all of her different names. And according to later Cheyenne land records, Mawissa is about 34 years old at the Battle of the Washita. Custer's first mention of Mawissa in his memoir when he goes to speak with the woman who had been captured right after the attack. Mawissa immediately steps forward and she tells Romero that she wished to speak on behalf of herself and her companions. So Romero translates, and Mawissa goes on to say to Custer himself, "You claim to be a chief. This man, Romero, says you are a big chief. If that is true, and you are what he claims, show that you can act like a great chief and secure for us that treatment which the helpless are entitled to." And then she places a young woman's hand on top of Custer's hand and starts to enact a ceremony. Romero tells Custer Mawissa is marrying him to a young maiden. Now, Custer portrays this as a rather whimsical and lighthearted scene, and historians usually focus on the moment because the young woman is often said to be Monacita, the chief Little Rock's daughter, who was rumored to have a relationship with Custer. But I want to focus on the scene for a totally different reason, because it shows Mawissa actively trying to marry a young woman to a man she sees as a great chief in an effort to win his protection for the captured women and children. The fight's not even over. Warriors from the other villages are beginning to surround the 7th Cavalry in Black Kettle's village, and the first thing Mawissa does is try to form an alliance by marriage. Mawissa will continue to distinguish herself and act as a spokeswoman for the captives, and she's mentioned again and again in all the accounts that deal with the Washita campaign, from the fight all the way through to the search for the Cheyenne that stretches into spring of 1869. But in the days following the Washita fight, when the 7th Cav returned to Camp Supply with the captives, correspondent de Bonneville-Kime wrote of Mawissa and Monacita, quote, "The sister and niece of Black Kettle passed among the sorrowing party, placing their hands upon the head of each, simultaneously repeating a few sounds." He continues, "The Osage had been promised all the Indian ponies they could capture, and the niece and sister of Black Kettle were told of this fact. They replied with an air of contempt, 'Let them have them. The Osage are poor.'" The Osage, tribal enemies of the Cheyenne, remain a threatening force toward the captives. Quote, "During the first few days after their arrival at Camp Supply, the captives manifest evident anxiety." So these women expect to be killed in retaliation for the atrocities committed by their people. In the Osage, there's, quote, "Spears upon which they hung the scalps of their foes were slung over their shoulders, and even their horses were decorated with scalps and strips of blue and red blankets." The night after they all arrived at Camp Supply, the Osage held a scalp dance. Quote, "They renewed their declarations of hostilities against the Cheyenne, and they chanted a song of triumph and recounted their deeds of daring." Now, at Camp Supply, listening to the Osage threats and knowing they were at the mercy of the soldiers, The Cheyenne captive women surely expected to be treated the way their warriors treated captives. If they were not killed and scalped at the scene of the attack, the captives were raped by the raiding party, and if they were lucky, the women were later married to a warrior, and the children would be adopted into the tribe. Bonneville Keim continues to write about Mawissa and Monacita, and they sort of steal the scene anytime they show up in any of their writings about the Washita, because both these women are so fascinating. But Keim writes, in constant dread of their fate, the sister and niece of Black Kettle visited the headquarters of the commanding general to ask him when they were to be killed, on the assurance that such was not the custom of white people toward women and innocent children. The women departed with light hearts, and their report soon changed the sullen and drooping spirits of the captives into a high degree of contentment and satisfaction at their change of life, and particularly the abundance of food they enjoyed. Now, this might sound like a really optimistic take of a tragic situation, but a fellow Cheyenne captive who was also taken at the Washita, Mrs. Lone Wolf, will say something similar in an interview in 1905. We had a law among ourselves that if we had any prisoners, and any of our people should be killed by the prisoners' friends, we should kill that many prisoners. We thought, therefore, when we heard this news, that a part of our people should be killed in retaliation. So our warriors asked how many were to be killed, so that they may prepare to die. They sent me to General Custer to find out. I was taken to him, and I asked him through the interpreter how many prisoners he was going to kill for Major Elliott. He covered his face in his hands and refused to speak for a minute. One of the soldiers started to drive me away, but Custer raised his head, saw that we were going away, and made the soldier bring us back. He said, "White people don't kill prisoners." He told me further that as long as we did not try to run away, and as long as we behaved ourselves, none of us would be hurt. So we built a big fire, and the smoke went straight up to the sky, so that the old Indians said that the Great Spirit was with us and would deliver us back into our tribe. Then we took the meat and ate it, the first we had eaten since the night before, though it had been offered to us before that day. From then on we had plenty to eat and good warm blankets to wear. So the role Mawissa fills is not necessarily a new one. Women, captive or not, were known to negotiate. Quote, captives and wives from other tribes played critical roles as intermediaries during times of war, largely because of their valuable language skills and connections to multiple tribes that came from captivity or intermarriage, and they could facilitate peace by drawing on their old kin ties and establishing new relationships. And that's in an article by David Boreas on Cheyenne women. So women's language and negotiation skills helped end the bloody conflict in the past. And there's one particular case between the Southern Cheyenne, Southern Arapaho Alliance, and their Comanche and Kiowa enemies back in 1840. And there was a gathering that the Cheyenne referred to as giving gifts across the river. And those peace talks had been initiated by captive wives, and Cheyenne women provided their handiwork in the gift exchange. General Miles, years later, would also rely on a trusted Cheyenne woman to help bring peace. U.S. Army Scouts had captured the Cheyenne woman named Sweet Woman, and she had become the intermediary to Cheyenne Chief Two Moons and helped end hostilities. As the campaign continued, Custer would trust Mawissa in this same way. In the spring of 1869, he would send her off to the Cheyenne in an attempt to end hostilities, and he would even give her his own knife to take on this trip. Custer refers to Mawissa as a, quote, a woman of superior intelligence who is strongly impressed with a desire to aid in establishing a peace between her people and the white man. Intermarriage between white men and Cheyenne women had long been established. The Southern Cheyenne especially had recently seen the lucrative and respected marriages of well-connected Cheyenne women to William Bent the frontier trader and rancher of Bent Fort's fame. And he had married 3 Southern Cheyenne sisters, including Owl Woman, and they were the daughters of the Cheyenne chief White Thunder. And you might remember from my earlier video about Clara Blinn that the trader Dutch Bill Griffenstein was married to Cheyenne Jenny, and she was the daughter of a noted Watapayu warrior and a member of Black Kettle's band. Cheyenne Jenny served as a business partner, interpreter, and negotiator and had been instrumental in freeing multiple white captives. For a more recent connection, Lieutenant Watson D. Crocker, who had been the commanding officer at Fort Larned, was also married to a woman of Black Kettle's band. His wife, Are You There, was the daughter of Chief Warbonnet, who had earlier met President Lincoln. So, keeping all of this in mind, and I know it's a lot, 1, the captives were afraid that they would be put to death or face a horrible punishment for the death of the soldiers, and or they were afraid that they'd be treated the way captives were treated by their own dog soldiers. And you can understand why Melissa's first reaction would be to marry a maiden to Custer. Charles Brill, when he accuses the Seventh of abuse, also makes this comment. It was Red Dress who appealed to Romeo, one of Custer's half-breed scouts, to save the women and children of Black Kettle's camp from the anticipated atrocities after their surrender. Out of gratitude for this intervention, Red Dress later offered Romeo one of her daughters to be his wife. Now, there is a tribal record of Romero marrying one of Melissa's daughters, a girl named Loving, and author Peter Harrison says this must have been the agreed match. But Loving is only 6 months old at the Battle of the Washita, and Romero doesn't actually marry Loving until years and years later. Personally, I think it's more likely that Melissa offered, similar to the way she had offered a maiden to Custer, one of her older daughters to Romero at Camp Supply. Melissa was 34 at the time, as I said earlier, and Cheyenne women marry in their early teens. And though I haven't found any evidence that she had a teenage daughter who was also a captive, Melissa was of an age that she could have had a daughter of marrying age. And it would not be the first time that a mother tried to create an alliance for her daughter. There is a record of Romero marrying a Washita captive who bore him a child within the year. So, if the Cheyenne women had been brutalized, and if Romero had been the one who facilitated that sexual violence against them, why would Melissa, in her powerful stance, more than a decade later, marry her daughter Loving to the man who had done that? However, there was a Cheyenne tradition of polygamy and of men marrying sisters. So if a connection had been made sooner between one of Melissa's daughters, I can understand how later on Romero would marry another. Again, this is conjecture on my part, but I think from what we read about Melissa's behavior that this is a possibility. Father Powell makes this statement in a footnote in his People of the Sacred Mountain book. He goes on to write in the same footnote, most non-Native American historians have ignored the Cheyenne statements concerning this mistreatment of the women by Custer and his men. It is indeed strange that historians have chosen to ignore the above Cheyenne testimony, as well as oral tradition, which still preserves knowledge of this soldier mistreatment of women from the tribe, noted above all others for its women's chastity. Unfortunately, Father Powell does not provide any actual details. If he's so frustrated that historians are not valuing Cheyenne statements, testimony, and oral tradition, why doesn't he actually supply those very statements and testimony, rather than relegating this to a mere footnote in his massive 2-volume, 1,441-page tome, People of the Sacred Mountain? However, Father Powell does mention Cheyenne historian John Stanson Timber as one of the people who confirmed the mistreatment. So I read through A Cheyenne Voice, the complete John Stanson Timber interviews with Margot Liberty. And I found that when asked about whether Custer had a son with Monacita, John Stanton Timber says, "I don't believe it." And he also says, "I have been unable to find the story of where they were together or how they came to live together." So interviewer Margaret Liberty tells him the rumors, and John Stanton Timber's response is, "If I had heard it that way back, I would think it was true, but not wait 40 or 50 years for these things to come up." John Stanton Timber, when he's asked more details, he does briefly mention Cheyenne women being sexually abused by soldiers, but he's clearly talking about circumstances that occurred at Sand Creek, not the Battle of the Washita. John Stanton Timbers mentions Colonel Chivington and John Smith. Chivington was the U.S. Army officer who attacked the Cheyenne at Sand Creek, and Smith was the interpreter scout at Sand Creek too, and neither Chivington nor Smith were at the Washita fight. When looking at the plight of the Washita captives, I find the relationships were more nuanced than historians allow. The women were not entirely powerless, as Mewissa's role shows. She asserted herself from the very beginning and acted as an advocate and spokesperson for the other captives. She had multiple meetings with General Sheridan and Lieutenant Colonel Custer. She traveled with the 7th Cavalry and the 19th Kansas as they continued their search for the Cheyenne, and she was trusted enough to be sent back to her tribe, only accompanied by one warrior as an emissary of peace. So maybe Romero led the women to believe they had a dreadful fate ahead in order to coerce them or frighten them into submission. And maybe Mewissa, using whatever advantage she and the women had available to them, tried to place some of them under the protection of powerful men as a way to shield them and create a safety net of familial relationships. And maybe during the 3-day march back to Camp Supply after the Washita fight, or during the 6 days that the 7th Cavalry was at Camp Supply before they continued their campaign, the women were abused. Perhaps there was a combination of all of the above, but it's hard to distinguish exactly what happened, and I don't think historians have looked into the many-faceted role that Mewissa played. As author and historian Stan Hoig wrote in his book, The Battle of the Washita, quote, "Charges were later made that the officers were allowed to choose from the young girl captives, but this has never been established." All right, guys, thank you so much for joining me. As always, there's my book list. If I've forgotten anything, if you have any comments, questions, please always leave them in the comment section and I'll try and get back to you with answers, footnotes, more information, whatever you like. Thank you to all my subscribers. You guys are fantastic. I appreciate it so much. And those of you who have not subscribed, please do and click your notification bell. I have more of these controversies in the works. And I want to give a special thank you to my friends Ron Morocco, Dale Cosman, and Michael Badhand. They're all incredible researchers. And if you are not familiar with the work of Michael Badhand especially, he is a historian, an actor. He has the most beautiful books out about Native American customs, traditions, warrior life. He lives the warrior life. He's just an incredible resource. So look him up on YouTube or Facebook. He's definitely worth following. You will learn so much, and he tells it as it is. So thanks, guys. I hope to see you soon. I appreciate your support and all these things, and I have a good time doing it. All right. Hope to see you next time. Bye.